the leaf falls from ignorance. In an interview with Venerable Thich Tway, someone asked the monk, "Where does the leaf fall from?" Without hesitation, the monk replied, "The leaf falls from ignorance." This answer left everyone around utterly astonished. They exchanged glances, some even burst into laughter because they did not understand, while others furrowed their brows in deep thought. For a brief moment, the atmosphere fell silent, as if someone had dropped a stone into a still pond, disturbing its surface and stirring in everyone a desire to know more. The interviewer, though somewhat embarrassed, maintained his courtesy. "Venerable, why do you say the leaf falls from ignorance?" Thich Tway smiled gently, as if ready to share the profound meaning hidden within his brief answer. His eyes shone with wisdom and compassion, and those listening could feel an extraordinary energy of peace emanating from him. The monk explained calmly, "At first glance, the leaf falls simply because the wind blows it away or because it is withered and no longer clings to the branch. These are external conditions. But on a deeper level, ignorance is the underlying cause that prevents us from seeing the impermanent nature of the leaf and of life itself. Because of ignorance, we mistakenly believe the leaf belongs to us, cling to it, and then suffer when it falls. The leaf, as with all phenomena, arises due to specific conditions, and when those conditions cease, it falls. Yet, due to our ignorance, we tend to attach to ideas such as the leaf is mine or the withering leaf is my sorrow, which in turn gives rise to suffering. Those present listened intently, and gradually their eyes lit up as if illuminated by a new stream of understanding. They came to realize that the falling leaf is not merely a natural occurrence, it is also a vivid symbol of impermanence and dependent origination. One person even nodded to himself, thinking, "We observe leaves falling every day, yet we rarely pause to reflect on why we feel sorrow or a touch of melancholy when we witness this." In Buddhism, ignorance is regarded as the source of suffering. It is the first link in the chain of dependent origination. Ignorance means not seeing the truth about the nature of all phenomena, specifically not understanding the Four Noble Truths: suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path to the cessation of suffering. To say the leaf falls from ignorance implies that because of ignorance, events continue to unfold and operate within the cycle of birth and death. If we compare life to a forest, then here the leaf represents the impermanent, fragile nature of all things, while ignorance is the root of our blinded mind that causes us to misidentify reality. Ignorance is not simply a lack of ordinary knowledge. It is a lack of clear insight into the truth of life. In Buddhism, the truth lies in understanding that all phenomena are impermanent, devoid of a permanent self, and subject to the law of dependent origination. Only when one clearly perceives this chain of conditions and realizes the insubstantial and empty nature of the self can one be liberated from suffering. Thus, saying, "The leaf falls from ignorance," can be understood as follows. Because of ignorance, we fail to recognize the natural law governing all things. We cling to the form of the leaf without realizing that it is simply following the law of dependent origination, arising, abiding, changing, and ceasing. Yet, because of our ignorance, we easily adopt the notions, "the leaf is mine," or "the withering leaf is my sorrow," which then give rise to suffering. The symbolic meaning of the falling leaf: impermanence. The falling leaf symbolizes the constant change inherent in life. As seasons change, leaves turn yellow and fall. This is natural. Nothing is permanent. All things continuously change. Recognizing impermanence helps us awaken and prevents us from clinging to the transient. Dependent origination. The falling of the leaf does not occur in isolation, but is the result of many conditions: weather, climate, the sap within the tree, natural aging, the wind, and so on. Each condition contributes to the leaf's fall. Similarly, every sentient being's life is the product of myriad causes and conditions: family, society, karmic forces, and consciousness. Letting go and mindfulness. The falling leaf reminds us to practice letting go. Just as a leaf on a branch cannot hold on to its inevitable decay, we too cannot cling to what must eventually pass away. Letting go here does not imply passivity. Rather, it means understanding that what is meant to come will come, and what is meant to go will go, as everything unfolds naturally according to the law of conditions, independent of our personal desires. The leaf falls from ignorance in daily life, clinging to the self. When in ignorance, we easily see ourselves as the center of everything, believing that all things belong to me. This leads to possessiveness, unrealistic expectations, and ultimately to disappointment and suffering. Attachment to phenomena. Not only do we cling to I, but we also cling to our own opinions and ideas, insisting that they are the absolute truth. This often leads to disputes and conflicts, drawing people into cycles of opposition instead of fostering understanding and love. Mental patterns and prejudices. Old beliefs, biases, and preconceived notions are also manifestations of ignorance. Just as a leaf may be infested by pests, our minds become encumbered and unable to live freely in the present moment. When we are led by ignorance, everything is obscured. We fail to see the true nature of things. Thus, while the falling leaf is merely a natural phenomenon, we project our worries and sorrows onto it, losing the true peace of the present moment. Many people, upon seeing falling leaves, tend to associate them with decay and separation. However, from a Buddhist perspective, the falling leaf also signifies liberation. It departs when its conditions are fulfilled, returning to the earth and merging into the endless cycle of existence. This natural process, free of blame, is simply the transformation from one form of existence to another. The image of the falling leaf reminds us to learn to let go of the fear of aging, loss, and change. In the Buddhist spirit, letting go means not clinging to any phenomenon, because all things exist only within a chain of dependent origination. As long as conditions prevail, things remain. When they cease, they naturally dissolve and fall away. The leaf falls from ignorance is a poetic image that carries profound meaning in Buddhism. It reminds us that all operations in this world are driven by ignorance, or conversely, by the enlightened insight through which we perceive and act differently. For those who have not penetrated ignorance, the falling leaf may seem tinged with sorrow. But for those who have realized the nature of dependent origination and impermanence, the image of the falling leaf becomes a source of inner peace, a deep understanding of natural law, and a path to liberation from suffering. Each time we encounter the moment of the falling leaf, we have an opportunity to pause, be mindful, and listen to the rhythm of impermanence in life. In doing so, we learn to return to our true selves, clearly recognize our ignorance, and make a determined effort to let go of attachments. In this way, we gradually walk the path of transforming suffering and find joy in every moment. When we clearly understand our ignorance, we can begin to eliminate it. Once ignorance is dispelled, we are liberated from the cycle of birth and death. We all know that in the 12 links of dependent origination, the Buddha taught that the first link is ignorance. From ignorance arise conditionings. From conditionings arise consciousness, name and form. The 6 sense bases: contact, sensation, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and aging and death. Thus, the suffering of birth, aging, illness, and death originates from ignorance. Therefore, if we wish our practice to bear fruit, that is, to attain liberation from the cycle of birth and death, we must first clearly understand our ignorance. Only by knowing it and then eliminating it can we truly be on the path of genuine practice. Let me begin by defining ignorance. The term ignorance literally means lack of light or clarity. The suffering inherent in life originates from ignorance. In its literal sense, ignorance signifies a state of delusion and darkness. However, ignorance also has another meaning as explained clearly in the scriptures by the Buddha. What is this other meaning? As stated in the Agamas, seeing phenomena without knowing them as they truly are is called ignorance. In other words, we perceive everything in life inaccurately, merely through mistaken imagination. That is ignorance. Thus, in the Agamas, it is always said, ignorance is not seeing or knowing things as they really are. More specifically, not knowing or seeing the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path is ignorance. This is the explanation given in the Agamas. The Vinaya texts provide another explanation. Once a bodhisattva asked, "Venerable, what is ignorance?" The Buddha replied, "Ignorance means regarding the aggregate of the body as real, and regarding the mind conditioned by the 4 characteristics and 6 realms as truly existent." In other words, clinging to the 5 aggregates as real and taking the conditioned mind as truly mine, this is ignorance. I ask you, monks and lay practitioners, do you possess ignorance? Surely everyone agrees that you do. For all of us see our body as real and assume that our thoughts and perceptions truly belong to us. Clinging to these two as if they were real is what we call ignorance. We are led by ignorance into the cycle of rebirth up to this day. A Buddhist practitioner does not aspire to be reborn in a higher realm or to gain material wealth in the next life. Rather, the goal is liberation from the cycle of birth and death. To achieve such liberation, one must eradicate ignorance. Without the elimination of ignorance, one cannot escape rebirth. Therefore, each of us must strive to develop a deep and clear understanding of ignorance. If we do not know it and eliminate it, then even lifetimes of practice will amount to little more than mere practice without true liberation. The Buddha divided ignorance into 2 types, fundamental ignorance and secondary ignorance. What is fundamental ignorance? And what is secondary ignorance? It is commonly understood that the Buddha said, "Ignorance conditions the formation of actions," meaning that accumulated karma leads consciousness to experience rebirth. Hence, the original ignorance is the root of rebirth. It is fundamental ignorance. Next, what then is secondary ignorance? Let us recall. Ignorance conditions formation. Formation conditions consciousness. Consciousness conditions name and form. Name and form condition the 6 sense bases. The sense bases condition contact. Contact conditions sensation. Sensation conditions craving. Craving conditions clinging. And clinging conditions existence. Craving and clinging are what we call secondary ignorance. Now, in our practice, we cannot eliminate the original ignorance because it belongs to the past. Therefore, our current practice focuses on eliminating secondary ignorance, the budding off of ignorance in this very life. Once that is eradicated, we are freed from the cycle of rebirth. But if we cannot eliminate it, we remain bound to the cycle of rebirth. As mentioned in the Agamas, not knowing the 4 noble truths of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path is called ignorance. Have you truly grasped the 4 noble truths? If you have, then you have received the liberating teaching of the Dharma. But right now, many of us are still adrift, not having fully realized the truth. Hence, we have not penetrated the essence of the 4 noble truths. Among these, the first truth is that of suffering. Do you see life as suffering or as joyful? It is suffering. Yet suffering only arises when one is troubled or angered by others. When praised by loved ones, one forgets suffering. That is, we suffer when we are saddened, but when commended by those dear to us, we are relieved of suffering. The Buddha taught that suffering exists because all beings born into this world experience 8 kinds of suffering: 4 physical, birth, aging, illness, and death, and 4 mental, attachment, separation, unfulfilled desire, and afflictive emotions. Among these, is there anyone who escapes them? Everyone with a body grows old, falls ill, and dies. Do you consider aging to be suffering? Yes, it is. Is illness suffering? Yes, it is. And is death suffering? Yes, it is. Yet, why do I not suffer when I age? Aging is painful only for those who do not practice. Without practice, one feels the body growing weak, becoming ill, and ultimately, all parts of the body suffer. However, if one practices, then aging is simply a natural event that no one can avoid, not even the Buddha could avoid it. For whoever has a body must age, fall ill, and die. That is the law of nature that no one can dispute. Since it is an inescapable law, why should we fear it? Instead of fear, we may smile and take things lightly, thereby reducing suffering. In this way, suffering does not truly exist. We suffer because we fear. Thus, aging only brings suffering to those who do not practice. When illness strikes, suffering follows. We tend to think that if one part hurts, then the whole body is in pain. And so we lament. It hurts so much, I can't bear it. When asked where it hurts, we say, I am in pain. But is it truly I who is hurting, or is it just that particular part? For instance, if the leg hurts, then only that part is affected. Other parts remain unaffected. If the stomach aches, it is localized. Why then must we suffer? We mistakenly generalize a part's pain as the pain of the entire self, thereby intensifying our suffering. Yet if we carefully observe the pain, say, in the leg and allow it to fade, the pain can diminish. But if we continue to agitate and complain, then the whole self suffers. Now consider death. The Buddha said death is suffering from the viewpoint of ordinary people because they cherish their bodies and wish to keep them. Yet for those who have attained the Dharma, death is not painful. Thus ordinary people nearing death weep and struggle while monks smile. So, is death necessarily suffering? Not necessarily. One who has realized the truth and seen the Dharma will not suffer. If one clings to the notion this body is mine, its loss means a loss, then that person will suffer. But this body is transient, a temporary collection of conditions that, when these conditions cease, will disintegrate. The true self, however, remains undiminished forever. Therefore, when the body is about to dissolve, one simply smiles, free of fear. The Buddha taught that suffering arises because ordinary people cling to the body. If we practice wisely and overcome our attachment to the self, then suffering will cease. Thus, the practitioner becomes one who does not suffer. But even so, do practitioners still suffer? Perhaps they do. Why? Because although the purpose of practice is to end suffering, if one practices without truly understanding the Buddha's teachings, one continues to suffer. Someone who deeply comprehends the Dharma finds joy in daily practice, smiling continuously because practicing is such a precious opportunity in this world. Yet many worldly attachments still bind Buddhist practitioners. Even ordained monks can be constrained by family ties. Meanwhile, those who do not live in monasteries seem entirely free, yet why do they suffer? Suffering arises when one sees others receiving the teacher's love while one does not, or when one sees that others receive offerings while one remains unrecognized. This suffering stems from clinging to one's own sense of self. Remember, those who have taken ordination are meant to lead a transcendent life, a life from which ordinary people are excluded. Even though many Buddhist practitioners are earnest, if they remain tied to family obligations, they are not truly free. When they see their revered teachers so at ease, they may think, how fortunate they are. Yet when one is blessed and still suffers, it is absurd. As practitioners, we must clearly understand why we practice and what our goal is. Only then will our practice truly lead to liberation. If we continue to see things from a worldly perspective, caught in cycles of love and hate, then suffering will persist indefinitely. Thus, suffering arises because we fail to see things as they really are. That is what I refer to as fundamental ignorance, so that you may grasp the overall idea. Next, I discuss secondary ignorance. We are all driven by ignorance that forms our karmic actions and leads us in the cycle of rebirth. Now that we have a body, we cannot eliminate the original ignorance, for it belongs to the past. Therefore, in our practice, we must work on eliminating secondary ignorance, the sprout of ignorance present in our current life. Once that is eradicated, we break free from rebirth. But if we cannot eliminate it, then we remain trapped in the cycle of existence. I have explained the Four Noble Truths earlier. If you have truly understood them, then you have received the liberating teaching of the Dharma. But now many of us still wander in delusion, having not fully grasped the truth, and so we fail to comprehend the essence of the Four Noble Truths. Among these truths, the first is that of suffering. On life's suffering in the body, do you see life as suffering or as joy? It is suffering, yet the pain appears only when one is disturbed. When praised by loved ones, one forgets the suffering. In other words, we suffer only when we feel sorrow, but when we are commended by those close to us, suffering vanishes. The Buddha taught that suffering exists because all beings are born into this world with 8 kinds of suffering: 4 physical, birth, aging, illness, death, and 4 mental: attachment, separation, unfulfilled desire, and other afflictions. Among these, can anyone truly escape them? Every being with a body must age, fall ill, and eventually die. Do you consider aging to be suffering? Yes, it is. Is illness suffering? Yes, it is. And is death suffering? Yes, it is. Yet why do I not suffer when I age? Aging is painful only for those who do not practice. Without practice, one experiences the body as weak, falls ill, and thus suffers. But if one practices, then aging is simply a natural event. No one, not even the Buddha, can avoid it. For everyone with a body must face aging, illness, and death. That is the undeniable law of the world. Since it is unavoidable, why fear it? Instead of succumbing to fear, we might smile and take things lightly, thus lessening our suffering. In this way, true suffering does not persist. We suffer because we fear. Therefore, aging is painful only for those who have not learned to practice. When illness strikes, suffering follows. We tend to assume that if one part of the body is in pain, the entire body suffers. And so we lament, "It hurts too much, I cannot bear it." But if we examine the pain closely, say, in the leg, we notice that only that part aches, while the rest remains unaffected. If the stomach hurts, it is localized. We mistakenly generalize the pain of a single part to the whole self, thereby intensifying our suffering. However, if we observe the pain mindfully, we may find that it gradually subsides. If, on the other hand, we continue to ruminate and complain, then the entire self suffers. Consider death. The Buddha said that death is suffering from the perspective of ordinary people because they cherish their bodies and want to hold on to them. Yet for those who have realized the Dharma, death is not painful. Thus, while ordinary people nearing death weep and struggle, enlightened monks smile. Is death necessarily suffering? Not exactly. One who has seen the truth and realized the Dharma will not suffer. If one clings to the idea, "This body is mine," losing it means loss, then suffering arises. But this body is transient, a mere assembly of conditions, and when those conditions cease, it disintegrates, while the true self remains undiminished forever. Hence, when the body is about to fade, one simply smiles free of fear. The Buddha taught that suffering arises because ordinary people cling to the body. If we practice wisely and overcome our attachment to the self, suffering will cease. Therefore, the practitioner becomes one who does not suffer. Yet, even so, do practitioners still suffer? Perhaps they do. Why is that? Because although the purpose of practice is to end suffering, if one practices without truly comprehending the Buddha's teachings, suffering continues. One who deeply understands the Dharma will find daily practice a source of joy, always smiling because to practice is a precious matter in this world. However, many worldly attachments still bind Buddhist practitioners. Even ordained monks are sometimes constrained by familial ties. And those who live outside the monastery, though seemingly free, still suffer. Suffering arises when one sees others receiving the teacher's love or offerings while one is neglected. This is born of clinging to one's own self. On the path to liberation, remember that those who have taken ordination are meant to lead a transcendent life, a goal that ordinary people cannot achieve. Even though many Buddhist practitioners are eager to practice, if they remain tied to family obligations, they are not truly free. When they see their revered teachers so at ease, they might think how fortunate they are. Yet when one is blessed and still suffers, it is absurd. As practitioners, we must clearly understand why we practice and what our ultimate goal is. Only then will our practice lead to liberation. If we continue to see things from a worldly perspective, caught in cycles of attachment and aversion, then suffering will never truly cease. Thus, suffering arises because we do not see things as they really are. This I call fundamental ignorance, so that you may grasp the overall idea. Next, I discussed secondary ignorance. We are all driven by ignorance that creates our karmic actions and leads us into the cycle of rebirth. Now that we have a body, we cannot eliminate the original ignorance, for it belongs to the past. Therefore, in our practice, we must work on eliminating secondary ignorance, the sprout of ignorance present in this life. Once that is eradicated, we break free from rebirth. But if we cannot eliminate it, we remain trapped in the cycle of existence. I have already explained the Four Noble Truths. If you have truly understood them, then you have received the liberating teaching of the Dharma. But many of us still wander in delusion, failing to grasp the truth fully, and thus we have not penetrated the essence of the Four Noble Truths. Among these, the first is the truth of suffering. On the practice of meditation and mindfulness, let us now move on to the subject, the key to the cycle of rebirth and liberation from it. This is an essential issue indeed, the key to the practice of every one of us. Every practitioner aspires to liberation, that is, to escape the cycle of rebirth. Therefore, we must know where the key to liberation lies, as well as where the key to the cycle of rebirth lies, so that we may stop or avoid it. The key to the cycle of rebirth lies in with thought, having mental activity, while the key to liberation lies in without thought, absence of mental agitation. This is a direct reference to meditation. The meditation tradition emphasizes non-thinking as its fundamental principle. Thus, non-thinking is paramount. So what is with thought? It is the constant mental chatter and rumination that leads us to remain trapped in the cycle of rebirth. Therefore, the core of practice must be to develop a state of non-thinking. When thoughts continue, the mind remains agitated and the practice yields no fruit. This is the fundamental obstacle in our practice. We must clearly recognize it. To quiet the mind, most of us need to sit in meditation. This is a means of keeping the mind calm, yet often, even after sitting for half an hour or 2 hours, many thoughts persist. Even ordained monks, who have ample time to practice, sometimes find it impossible to completely quiet their minds. Imagine then the layperson. Over the years, we have become so accustomed to endless thinking about one matter after another that now we must learn to think only when necessary and let go when not. Achieving that is a significant step forward. If, after long practice, one still fails, it is due to insufficient effort. To completely halt thought, one must learn to master oneself at all times, whether walking, standing, lying down, or sitting. If one practices only during meditation but lets the mind wander uncontrollably during other activities, then no true progress is made. With persistent effort to not let thoughts drag us along, one will eventually appreciate the benefits and the efficacy of the practice. Conversely, if one remains adrift, believing that a lifetime of practice will yield nothing, then that is the core problem. Liberation from the cycle of rebirth means to stop thought, to extinguish the chain of thoughts. Whatever hinders our practice must be overcome. Whatever fosters progress must be cultivated so that our lifetime of practice bears fruit. There are many things that may seem trivial yet are exceedingly difficult to perfect. For example, initiating or halting a thought is your own right, but while thoughts arise naturally, stopping them is another matter entirely. If we let our thoughts rule us, we inevitably remain in the cycle of rebirth. That is clear. If we do not master ourselves, we will always be pulled into the cycle. Everyone vows to practice to escape rebirth, but if one cannot master one's thoughts, how can that vow be fulfilled? Both ordained monks and lay people who are determined to break free from rebirth must give their utmost effort. Practice is a grand aspiration. If you wish to escape rebirth, you must strive to master every single thought. It is not a one-way process. Even if you are thinking good, lofty thoughts of liberation, suddenly mundane thoughts intrude, happening so rapidly that you cannot control them. Hence, one remains caught in the cycle of karmic creation and rebirth. This is a truly significant matter. We vow to practice for our own liberation and to help save sentient beings. But if we ourselves still suffer, how can we possibly help others? One must first resolve one's own suffering before attempting to alleviate the suffering of others. Without relieving one's own suffering, any effort to rescue others is ineffectual. A noble effort requires persistent and diligent practice in every action. If one makes a grand vow to be free from rebirth, yet cannot control one's mind in the face of ignorance and afflictions, then the practice has not advanced far enough. Regret after the fact is far too late. That is often the stumbling block we encounter. I urge all ordained monks to remember the precepts they have undertaken. When one is ordained, a monk vows to uphold 250 precepts, and a nun vows to uphold 348 precepts. When you vow before the Buddha, have you fulfilled them completely? Or have you allowed some to fall by the wayside? If you have vowed, then you must strive to observe them fully. If the 3 poisons have not been overcome, how can one conquer any other afflictions? A practitioner must regard the 3 poisons as enemies and prevent them from coming near. Only then will practice be successful. If we treat the 3 poisons lightly, getting angry at the slightest provocation, shouting or quarreling, then we are no better than ordinary people. Practice is not something that in a single morning or afternoon will eradicate all our faults. Sometimes it may take a lifetime. For example, if someone offends you one year and you become angry, and the next year you still harbor that anger, then that is a clear sign of stagnation. Do not expect lofty results without seeing whether your inner self has diminished its faults. Always reflect on yourself. Do not simply point out the faults of others while neglecting your own. A true practitioner must recognize his own errors in order to progress, while focusing solely on the faults of others only breeds irritation and anger. Correct your own faults and allow others to resolve theirs. Do not merely sit around discussing Teacher A made this mistake, Teacher B made that mistake, while neglecting to address your own shortcomings. Among us, many are truly admirable, those who approach me to confess their faults. When asked the reason, they say, "I made a mistake before, and since my fellow practitioners did not correct me, I now recognize my error and humbly ask for forgiveness." These are courageous and commendable individuals. Many, however, when faulted or criticized, refuse to acknowledge their mistakes, which is truly a sign of weakness. Every day we live is due to the kindness and support of those who help us. We do not produce money, food, clothing, etc., yet we are able to eat and dress warmly. Therefore, we must engage in practice to repay that kindness. Each person should strive to fulfill their aspiration in practice, so that our afflictions diminish with each passing day and our minds become ever clearer. That is true practice. If we merely see the faults in others without addressing our own, then we have not truly understood the path. I urge all ordained monks to diligently remember and apply these teachings.